Welcome to I've Heard of Her, our monthly series about women's history with the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, which is part of the Kenosha Museum campus. This time we are talking about Betsy Ross. So we will get into her life just after we introduce ourselves. So my name is Jenn Edginton. I'm curator of social studies education here at the museum campus, and I'm really excited to be here with you.
Yay! I'm Samantha Machalik. I am the registrar here at the museum campus. So I work with the care and maintenance of the collection. So this is very exciting. Why are we doing this program? So we've been doing this almost a year now.
Yeah, since September.
Pretty great. For the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage and the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. So that's why we do this, so we can highlight women's history stories as well, because a lot of times they don't get highlighted. So that's what we're here trying to do. If you've watched our videos before, or way back when you came to see our program in person.
Seems like forever ago. Yeah.
It does. It seems so long ago. Usually what we do is we really try and highlight a woman that you may have heard of, but you don't know her whole story. And we really try and focus fully on her. A lot of times the way that these women's stories are written revolve around the men in their lives. But we try not to do that. Having said that, today we're going to do that. Betsy Ross, which we're going to get into, she doesn't have a big story outside of what you know about her, the sewing of the flag, besides what happened with the men in her life. So that's what we're going to talk about. In addition to the flag story, don't worry, we're going to talk about that. But she's kind of different in that she has to be in relation to the men. She's actually like kind of a perfect example of widowhood, single motherhood, managing a household and property and a business, and kind of remarrying. So we're going to get into all that. It's going to be good.
And I think that she's our kind of second oldest that we're talking about. Pocahontas we talked about in person, and now we're talking about Betsy Ross. The reason we picked Betsy Ross is, of course, we had the 4th of July not that long ago, so we really wanted to dive into the flag story and see if it's true or not. Yeah. Spoiler alert.
But that's also another reason you're just seeing our faces right now. Betsy Ross was alive during the American Revolution. There's no photographs of her. So we have a few images at the end, but sorry, you're just going to have to look at our faces for the majority of the time.
Whoops. All right, so we'll go ahead, we'll get started a little bit about Betsy Ross's childhood. Again, not that much is known about her because, and we'll talk about this later, but really her story came out after her death. So she was born Elizabeth Griscom in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in January 1st, 1752 to her parents Samuel and Rebecca. Her parents had a little, they were Quakers, and they had such as a author of a book I read, an explosive chemistry, that they actually kind of got in trouble with some of the Quaker faith members because they had a little PDA. I know, shocker.
That's
so a little bit about Betsy Ross's parents. Her great-grandfather arrived in this area 1 year before William Penn founded Philadelphia. So just to kind of give some perspective of the context of timing there. And when she is born, so 1752 is the same year that Philadelphia gets the Liberty Bell. Again, just some context. She herself is named after her aunt. Her dad is a carpenter, and he works with his brother, so with her uncle, and they're kind of considered above average money-wise in Philadelphia at the time. They actually have 17 children that are born. So Samuel and Rebecca have 17 children. Betsy is the 8th out of those 17, and only 9 survive into adulthood. So that's quite a high rate, which is sad.
That's very
Um,
sad.
yeah, and she was raised Quaker, and she was raised in the house that her great grandfather built in Philadelphia. So that's kind of neat. That's a neat little tidbit.
Yeah, well, family.
She went Yeah, she went to school at a young age, so she didn't go to what we kind of consider our preschool and kindergarten or anything. She went to finishing school. So again, it's not learning the same things that we learn in school, but it's learning how to really focus on her religion and also the roles of women within the community. So it's a finishing school that she goes to. At 17, she becomes an apprentice. So she's actually an apprentice for an upholster. So she starts really starting her career as a seamstress, as a sewer. There, she falls in love. So
Mhm.
she meets John Ross, her first husband, while she is an apprentice. They elope in Hugg's Tavern in New Jersey in November 4th, 1773. And it's really, they elope because they're different religions. So she's a Quaker, he's not, and she actually has to leave the Quaker faith because of this marriage. And at this time, she's only 21. They open up a shop together. So in 1775, so they've been married for 2 years at this point. And unfortunately, John dies very young in 1776. After he joins the local militia. Betsy's only 24 when he passes away, and she continues to run this business because she needs the extra money, and she's starting to do some other work outside that, just upholstery and just clothing. So we'll talk about that too.
Mhm. Yeah, so she's only 24 years old. She's already a widow. Um, she marries again, though, on June 15th, 1777. She marries Joseph Ashburn. They end up having 2 daughters, but one passes away at 9 months old. Again, that child mortality rate in the 18th century is really harsh. Ashburn was a sailor. He worked on ships. So he was often away at sea, leaving her alone with the children, and having to work on her own at the upholstery shop. In 1781, the American Revolution still happening, and his ship is actually captured by a British frigate, and they're taken to England, the whole entire crew, and thrown in jail and charged with treason. So now she has a husband that's charged with treason. They're in Plymouth, England. And unfortunately, Joseph Ashburn, he dies in England of an unknown illness in prison in 1782. What's even more unfortunate is his death came just a few short weeks before all the American prisoners were released, with no charges filed or anything. So once again, Betsy's a widow. She's 30 years old at this point, and she has one child now. Still has the upholstery business though, and she meets another man, John Claypool. He was a fellow sailor with her second husband, and he was a prisoner with him as well, and came to Philadelphia to tell Betsy about her husband's death.
Ooh.
And so yeah, but they meet, they become friends and something more because they end up getting married on May 8th, 1783. Um, and they ended up being together for 34 years, and they had 5 children. So her third marriage ends up being a lifelong one. They joined the Free Quakers together, so she finally goes back to her Quaker religion. But these Quakers were a bit different from the ones from her childhood, because these ones they supported the American Revolution. So a large tenet of the Quaker faith is peace, and they're against war. But these ones saw the necessity to rebel against the British, and so they split off and started their own sect. And They both continued to run the upholstery business. In 1793, Betsy took in her niece after her parents and sister died of yellow fever. So now they have an extended family living with them as well. And even more people move in because in 1812, her daughter Clarissa moved in with her 5 children and being pregnant with her 6th after Clarissa was widowed. So Clarissa will actually live with and raise her children with Betsy and John Claypool for the rest of her life as well, working with Betsy at the upholstery shop, and that's how supporting this ever extending family. John Claypool ends up dying in 1817. He had a long illness. We're not really sure what it was. It could have been related to a stroke. It could have been related to injuries sustained from the war. We're not sure. But he passes away in 1817, making Betsy a widow once again. But this time she doesn't remarry. Betsy and Clarissa run the shop until 1828, when at age 76, Betsy decides to retire. She moves out to the suburbs on a farm with her daughter Susanna, and just kind of does her own thing out there. She makes sure, even with failing eyesight, she takes a carriage every week to the Quaker meetings miles away. So she's very dedicated to her Quaker faith, which makes her elopement with her first husband seem even more precious because she had to give that up, which is amazing. Anyway, she eventually goes blind in 1833, which is sad. And so she moves back into the city of Philadelphia to live with her another daughter, Jane. And she passes away and on January 30th, 1836, at the age of 84.
That's my birthday. Not the same year, but.
Maybe you are Betsy Ross reincarnated.
Yeah, and a little bit more about, so that's such a snapshot of her life, and that's kind of all we know for sure. But there's kind of this myth about her that she's bigger than just kind of this outline we gave you, and that is the story of the flag and her sewing the first American flag. So we wanted to talk about that a little bit because we all learn it in elementary school. I mean, in 3rd grade, I was Betsy Ross in my living wax museum. And now I think about it, and what did I actually talk about for 5 minutes? But the myth or the story goes that George Washington, Robert Morris, and George Ross came into her shop and requested her help to create a new flag. So Betsy Ross listened, heard what they were saying, and then she told Washington actually he wanted 6 points on the stars, but that was too much for her, and she wanted 5. She thought the cutting would look better and it would look better. And so she's kind of credited as especially the star component. And then she was asked by Washington if she could make the flag, and she responded, "I do not know, but I will try." And she made it for them in her parlor, according to the story. Unfortunately, there's no historic evidence that this happened. And there's a ton of information from the Revoir, especially from Washington and these higher ups that would have been visiting her house. So there's nothing that says this really happened. And nobody even talks about it until her grandsons. So William Canby writes a paper in 1870. So that's a long time after. And he presents his paper, The History of the Flag of the United States, to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1870. And he is basing the stories on what his grandma told him, according to him, his memory, grandma memory, and people of the community's memory. And he even got family members to sign this, saying that, hey, look, this is a real thing. We're not saying that William is lying. This is the first time that this story is heard, is presented, is acknowledged. And it's almost 100 years after. So you kind of have to look in the historic record. Is it true? Is it not? Some scholars questioned right away if this was a real thing, if the document was legal, what's going on. And then another thing is she did make flags. We know that she was part of the upholstery business, was making flags, making cartridge boxes, helping out the army at this time. But can we for sure say that she made the flag? No. Some of the arguments that say, like, yes, Betsy Ross did it, is George Ross, who's in that story, is the uncle of her first husband, John. So there is some family connection there. And he was very involved in the Revolutionary War and very much for the Rev cause. And then Betsy Ross and John Ross did make bed hangings for George Washington in 1774. So there is some connection between Washington and the Rosses, more so than George Ross, too. In May 29th of 1777, Betsy Ross is paid a large sum of money from the Pennsylvania State Navy Board for making flags. And on June 14th, so not that far after 1770, Congress adopts the Stars and Stripes as the official national flag. So again, maybe coincidence, maybe it means she made the flag. We don't know. And that's unfortunate because with history especially, we need to use the evidence to really back up our claims, and there's just none here. And then she made flags. She continued to make flags for over 50 years, and she did have government contracts to make those flags too. And then also in the 18th century, the flags were not what we consider today. They didn't have the kind of patriotism and this legendary story behind the flag that we have today. So maybe the first one wasn't quite the big story that we think it is, or maybe it was. Again, we don't know.
We don't know, and it's unfortunate. So she might have done it. She might not have done it. Why do we remember her though? That's the thing about all of this, right? She, by all accounts, she was an average woman, everyday woman from Philadelphia who happened to live during the Revolution and supported the cause by making flags. So there's this great article, you can find it online, by Dr. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. She's in Harvard. She actually is the woman who coined the phrase, well-behaved women rarely make history. She was actually talking about Puritans. That's a whole other talk. And she wrote this article called How Betsy Ross Became Famous. And she brings up a ton of points about why we remember this woman. So, as Jenn said, her grandson brought it out in 1870. So, what's happening around this time? What main event do we know just ended?
Civil
Could
War.
it be the Civil War? Right? That ended in 1865. In 1870, America is still trying to heal itself, figure out what it's supposed to be doing after this, catastrophic watershed event in our history. So one of the things that came out of the Civil War is flags are important now. Again, Jenn just said flags weren't important then. Civil War happens, now flags are important because that flag, the Stars and Stripes, was a symbol of the Union. So, this, and in the coming decades after, they became even more important. By the Spanish-American War, after that quick victory for the U.S., flags were everywhere. And they're kind of still everywhere today. You know, businesses fly flags, homes fly flags. It's just a normal everyday thing to see a ton of American flags during your day. You don't really think about it. But that wasn't normal before. So when this story comes out about the first flag for a country that's trying to reinvent itself, and this symbol is now important, that could be why we kind of grasped onto this story. Um, she also points out that, like we've kind of said, she's distinctly American, right? She was a businesswoman. She was an ordinary woman who used her skills in order to help the nation in a patriotic way. You know, that's the American work ethic right there, right? So, but she was also just one of many women who actually have stories about helping the war effort. There's many women who made flags. Um, there's a quote from George Henry Preble. He was an early American historian, and he included a story about this flag that was um, presented to John Paul Jones, who was a hero of the American Navy, and it was made from women's like petticoats and their dresses, and so he wanted to display it as, you know, this proud patriotic thing. And that was a common thing, a common theme of some of these flags, where women were giving up pieces of their everyday lives in order to make these flags, and that's how they were contributing to the war effort. And that continues. And sorry, my papers are sticking together in my notes. And so another historian, Carol Birkin, wrote, "These stories of Revolutionary War heroines reveal surprising humor and resourcefulness. In them, young girls chew and swallow documents rather than having them discovered by the enemy. Middle-aged women listen at keyholes to spy on military planning sessions, and old women serve liquor to soldiers and rob them of their guns." But the problem is, as Jenn mentioned as well, there's little documentation about any of these stories. We don't know a lot of women's names at this time that would have helped out the war effort. And I think that's another reason why Betsy Ross sticks out in our mind, because, you know, she's a woman that we know. How many women of the Revolutionary era can you name? Abigail Adams comes to mind besides that. But
Sybil.
there you go. There's not a ton, you know? And so that's another reason, is we actually have her name. We have some record that she was a real person, and so we can connect to her in that way. Another thing that I found fun, which I didn't know, I got in a rabbit hole about Lady Liberty. Lady Liberty did not look how we see Lady Liberty today in the Statue of Liberty. So she used to have a tie, look more like an ancient Roman freedwoman. So she had like symbolism tied to that. And antebellum slaveholders didn't like that Lady Liberty, who is supposed to represent the freedom of this country, was directly tying to the freedom of slaves. They're like, no, we can't have that. And so Betsy Ross, even after the Civil War, which we're still dealing with a lot of the controversies surrounding racial justice and equality from that era, they wouldn't want that imagery in there, to have Lady Liberty tied to the freedom of slaves. So Betsy Ross, she's a white woman from Philadelphia, and that's all we know about her. So she's a lot less controversial apparently than Lady Liberty, and so that was another reason why she became a symbol of the revolution. And like I kind of mentioned before, she embodies 19th century gender roles as well. Even though she was born and lived in the 18th century, when her story comes out in the 19th century, she perfectly embodies these gender roles of, she was able to quickly remarry to have a nuclear family and have a head of household that is a male. She was able to use women's skills to support her and add to their income. And she challenged Washington's design for the flag, right? Because he wanted 6 stars, and she goes, no, five's the way to go. But she didn't challenge the gender division of labor. She didn't say, well, if you want 6 stars, make it yourself. She said, no, well, I'll make it for you, but it's going to be 5 stars. So there's also that whole dynamic as well. She wasn't challenging his decisions on the war or anything like that. She was using, her role as a woman to do what she could for the cause of liberty. So, it's
Well, and I wonder if it mirrored some of the women's what happened to them during the Civil War too, right? Because women were stepping out of the home and working, and some of it was supporting those on the front, and some, supporting their families. So I wonder if that resonated with women too, or husbands that saw their wives have to take on new capacities to help the army, help the cause, and all that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that her story coming out after the Civil War is super important. And that's a really good point. Like, um, women during the Civil War would have done very similar things, making
Mhm.
homemade flags and things like that. And so that's an excellent point, and probably, that could be it.
I try. We do in our museum, if you come to visit, we do have an amazing flag that was made by the women of Kenosha that went off with the first volunteer regiment that came out of Kenosha, or company that came out of Kenosha. So check that out too.
Yeah.
All right, so we thought we would share some images that we put together. There's not a lot, so bear with me while I switch over. Okay, so we have here some paintings, and we don't know if that's what Betsy Ross really looked like. We don't know if that's what really happened in the parlor with her presenting the flag. Um, I saw another painting where she had a beautiful giant wig and was in very expensive clothing. That's probably not the case for an upholsterer doing work. So she wouldn't be sewing the flag in a gorgeous gown.
Yeah, it was like a Marie Antoinette
Yeah.
wig that she was wearing. I saw that picture too. If you just Google Betsy Ross, it's one of the first images that come up, if you want to know what we're talking about. But yeah,
I
that's probably not accurate.
Exactly. And I do like this picture because it does have such detail, the one of her with her scissors hanging off of her lap. And again, that very patriotic feel to that picture, right? All right. And then this is also a picture of the flag that well, not the exact flag that but the one that would look like her first flag.
Yeah.
And then the Betsy Ross house in Philadelphia is available for tours. I went there a long time ago, so I don't necessarily remember any of the details, which is probably not great, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, in my research, I found that they're really active and they're
Mhm.
very dedicated to sharing Betsy Ross's story. But I also found that that's probably not her house that they're even in. She might have maybe lived in the area, and that's why they chose this house, because it also is a Revolutionary era house. But yeah, I've heard really good things. I've never been there, but
Yeah,
check
and
it out.
it's located really close to the Liberty Bell area and the Constitution Center and kind of that old town Philadelphia.
Mhm.
All right, so if you know us, I'm going to move us, but if you know our program, we like to ask questions to really get a dialogue going. It's better in person, but we're doing the best we can with social media. So we hope that you comment on this post and maybe we can create some kind of conversation. So what do you think Betsy Ross would make of how we see her today? So Samantha, what do you think about that question?
I think for me, right, if I'm I was this average person. I maybe made some flags. I raised my family. Um, I feel like it'd be weird to come, you know, 200 and almost 50 years later and see that I've become kind of a myth, you know,
Mhm.
up there with George Washington and the cherry tree and like the first Thanksgiving. She's kind of become another one of our great American myths, right? And I feel like as a real person, that to me that would feel weird.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be interesting because we could finally know, did she make it or
Yeah,
didn't she? But
right.
yeah, to do something that's your job. And at the time, I'm sure that it wasn't seen as any different because there were so many women making flags to be seen as kind of this the only person that was making flags is
Hmm.
really, really interesting. Yeah. So if you have any ideas or thoughts, please share on our comment section of our social media. We'd love to
Yeah.
hear from you.
Hmm.
So I cut off the next one. I'm sorry, Samantha. But do you want to
That's
say who the
okay.
next person is?
Yes, next month we're going to talk about Queen Liliuokalani. She it was the last monarch of Hawaii. We are especially excited about this one because we were supposed to do her back in March, but then things happened and we had to cancel that program. So we're very excited to be able to present her to you. She's an amazing woman, and I'm so excited to be able to tell her story.
Yeah, we're really excited to talk about Queen Liliuokalani. We hope to see you next month. So that will be the third Thursday of August. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you enjoyed it. Bye.